It began like so many stories do, not with warning, but with aftermath. A quiet suburban street, flashing lights against a midnight sky, crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. Inside the home, nothing but silence and blood. Authorities arrived to a scene they could hardly comprehend. Furniture overturned, walls marked with chaos, a lifeless body on the floor, and standing nearby, barely old enough to vote, a teenager. Blank expression, hands stained, a future gone. No one saw it coming, not the family, not the teachers, not even the closest friends. To most, this was just another young face in the crowd, until everything changed, until a single decision tore a life away and left a community paralyzed. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't the work of a career criminal hardened by years of crime. This was something far more unsettling. This was the moment innocence ended and something unrecognizable took its place. What drives a young mind to murder? What unseen pressures, traumas, or obsessions simmer beneath the surface, hidden behind quiet smiles and routine days, until one day they explode into something unimaginable? Tonight we confront that question head-on. This is not a story of coincidence. This is the story of deliberate choices, irreversible consequences, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are the ones we least expect. You're watching America's most dangerous young killers, sentenced to death and life behind bars. And this case is one you won't forget. They were young, some just barely out of childhood, yet the crimes they committed defy logic, compassion, and understanding. In towns across America, the unthinkable unfolded not at the hands of hardened adults, but of teenagers, sons, daughters, classmates, children whose names would soon appear in headlines, alongside words like murder, life sentence, and death row. This episode explores the lives and lethal choices of some of America's most dangerous young offenders, individuals who shattered every expectation of what youth should represent. Their crimes were not impulsive outbursts or fleeting mistakes. They were calculated, brutal, permanent. We examine the cases that sent shockwaves through the nation, moments where innocence died in more ways than one. Each story is a study in contradiction. Youthful faces behind steel bars, school portraits shown in courtroom evidence, families left with only questions, and victims who never had a chance to grow old. These are not cautionary tales. These are deeply unsettling realities. In this episode, we'll take you case by case through some of the most haunting examples of youth-driven violence in recent American history. You'll hear how these crimes unfolded, from the first disturbing signs to the final tragic acts. We'll dissect the investigations, the courtroom dramas, and the legal battles that followed. Through interviews, archived footage, expert analysis, and court records, we will uncover the details the public rarely sees. We'll examine not just what happened, but why, exploring the motives, the psychological profiles, and the upbringing of these young offenders. You'll hear from law enforcement officials who arrived first on scene, prosecutors who fought for justice, and in some cases, the very people who survived. Some of the killers you'll learn about were sentenced to die. Others will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. All of them share one thing in common. Their youth did not save them from the weight of the law or from the gravity of what they did. This is more than a retelling of crimes. It's an examination of a troubling phenomenon, how the face of violence is changing, and why the youngest criminals may also be among the most dangerous. Welcome to America's most dangerous young killers, sentenced to death and life behind bars. Case 2. The truth starts now. Red hair, freckles, glasses. By all appearances, Eric Smith was just another kid riding his bike through his small New York neighborhood in the summer of 1993. He was 13, awkward, quiet, often alone, bullied by classmates for his appearance and slow speech. He didn't fit in, but no one ever imagined what he was capable of. And then came August 2nd. 4-year-old Derrick Robie lived just a few houses away. That morning, like most, he was eager to get to summer camp. His parents, running slightly behind, agreed to let him walk the short distance on his own. It was a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Derrick never made it to camp. Within hours, search efforts began. By early afternoon, his body was found in a wooded area just off the footpath. What investigators discovered was beyond comprehension. The child had been lured into the trees, beaten with rocks, and strangled. His injuries were brutal, deliberate, and whoever did it left no obvious trace. The town of Savona, New York, was paralyzed. How could something like this happen here, in broad daylight, to a child so young? For days, there were no leads, no suspects. Then Eric Smith came forward, not as someone confessing, but as someone curious. He claimed he had seen Derrick the morning he disappeared. He wanted to help. He wanted to talk to the police. But investigators noticed something off. His story shifted. Details changed. He knew too much. And then, without warning, Eric broke down. He confessed. He had led Derrick into the woods. He had thrown a large rock at his head. He had strangled him. He had even inserted objects into the child's body. It was violent, calculated, cruel. The nation recoiled. A 13-year-old had murdered a 4-year-old with his bare hands. The motive? Even Eric struggled to explain it. Anger, frustration, years of being bullied, years of rejection. And Derrick, so small, so vulnerable, became the target of all that rage. Psychiatrists called it explosive rage disorder. Others believed it went deeper, something darker, something hardwired. Some said he simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill. His trial drew national attention. Because Eric Smith wasn't being charged as a child, he was being tried as an adult. In court, his defense team painted a picture of a boy broken by relentless bullying, a lonely child with no friends and few coping mechanisms. But prosecutors argued that his actions were far too intentional, far too brutal to be dismissed as a spontaneous act of frustration. The jury agreed. Eric Smith was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum allowed for a juvenile at the time, 9 years to life. But his incarceration would stretch far beyond that. Denied parole 10 times. Each appearance before the board reopened the wounds for Derrick's family, who attended every hearing, fighting to keep him behind bars. But in 2021, after 27 years in prison, Eric Smith was granted parole. He was 41 years old. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some saw redemption, others saw a lifelong predator, and Derrick's family was left with only memories and a sentence that, for them, would never end. This case forced America to confront a chilling truth. Sometimes, the face of a killer isn't that of a hardened adult. It's a child on a bicycle, riding past your front yard. Innocence is not a guarantee, and even in the safest neighborhoods, the unimaginable can become reality. Eric Smith is now a free man. Derrick Robie never got the chance to grow up. And for a quiet town in upstate New York, the summer of 1993 remains a wound that never truly healed. To understand what happened that morning in Savona, New York, we have to look further back, beyond the headlines, beyond the confession, and into the world Eric Smith lived in long before he met Derrick Robie. Eric was a child marked by difference. He was small for his age, with bright red hair and thick glasses. His ears stuck out. He struggled socially. He spoke with a stutter. These traits made him a target, and by the time he was in middle school, the torment was relentless. Older students mocked him daily, called him names, knocked his books from his hands. Even his younger peers joined in. Teachers described him as quiet, respectful, but noticeably withdrawn. He struggled to connect. He had no close friends. His few interests, biking, tinkering with electronics, were solitary. At home, he was obedient, though sometimes prone to outbursts. His parents were unaware of just how deep the bullying had cut him. What no one could see was the anger that had been quietly building beneath the surface. A slow, dangerous boil. And then, on the morning of August 2nd, 1993, it found a target. Derrick Robie was 4 years old, blonde-haired, wide-eyed, full of energy. That morning, he was dressed in a Cubs t-shirt, ready for day camp. It was just a few blocks away. His mother, like so many, believed it was safe. It always had been. But safety that day was an illusion. As Derrick walked to the park, he encountered Eric Smith, 13 years old, riding his bike alone. No one knows exactly what was said between them. Eric would later claim he lured Derrick off the sidewalk, saying he had a shortcut through the woods. Derrick followed. Once they were out of sight, Eric attacked. With his bare hands, he struck the boy. He knocked him down. He strangled him. Then he picked up a large rock and dropped it repeatedly on Derrick's head. He defiled the body with a stick. The violence was not impulsive. It was methodical, deliberate, chilling in its cruelty. Eric left Derrick's lifeless body lying face up in the dirt, just yards from the camp entrance. He returned home, ate lunch with his family, said nothing. For days, investigators searched for leads. Eric even attended Derrick's memorial with his parents. He showed curiosity, asked questions about the case, inserted himself into conversations. But behind that curiosity was a weight he couldn't carry. Several days later, Eric walked into a police station with his mother. She sat silently beside him as he turned to the officer and said the words no one expected. "I'm the one who killed Derrick." The room fell still. In his confession, Eric detailed the crime with disturbing clarity. How he had felt a sudden urge, how he couldn't stop himself, how he just lost it. When asked why he chose Derrick, he gave a chilling response. He was easy. He admitted that hurting Derrick made him feel powerful for the first time in his life. That, in those few terrible moments, the pain he'd carried for years had found release. But it wasn't rage in the traditional sense. It was cold, detached, a release without remorse. Psychologists would later describe his affect as flat. He showed little emotion. When asked if he knew what he had done was wrong, he said yes, but not because he felt guilt, only because he knew society would say it was wrong. His case posed troubling questions. Was Eric born broken? Or did the years of cruelty, neglect, and emotional isolation twist something inside him that could never be untangled? In the days that followed, news of the murder and confession spread across the country. The face of Eric Smith, innocent, boyish, was now forever linked with one of the most horrifying child-on-child crimes in American history. Savona would never be the same. Neither would the way the justice system and the public viewed youth violence. Because in that quiet town, on that ordinary summer morning, a 13-year-old showed the world that the capacity for violence doesn't come with age. It comes with pain. It comes with rage. And sometimes it walks on two small legs through the trees and into the shadows, where childhood ends and something far more terrifying begins. Eric Smith's confession stunned law enforcement, but shock quickly gave way to the procedural demands of the justice system. A child had been murdered. Another child had admitted to the crime. And now, a legal battle unlike any the town or much of the nation had ever seen was about to begin. Investigators moved quickly, retracing Eric's steps, corroborating his confession, and collecting forensic evidence from the crime scene. They confirmed what he had said was true. His knowledge of the body's position, the location of the injuries, and details never released to the public, everything aligned. But there was another, more difficult question to answer. Was Eric Smith mentally ill or simply evil? Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him. What they found was deeply unsettling. Eric showed signs of emotional disturbance. He struggled with impulse control and exhibited symptoms of what would later be described as intermittent, explosive disorder, a condition marked by sudden episodes of extreme aggression. But he wasn't delusional. He wasn't hallucinating. He understood what he had done. And perhaps most chilling of all, he showed little to no remorse. He could describe the crime without flinching. His tone was flat, his expression neutral. One psychologist noted that Eric Smith had all the hallmarks of a child who had never developed empathy, that his years of being isolated, taunted, and dismissed had created not just a reservoir of pain, but a dangerous void, a void that, in the absence of connection or compassion, became something else entirely. The prosecution moved to try him as an adult. It was a controversial decision. He was 13 years old, but the nature of the crime left the court with little choice. The brutality, the deliberation, the total lack of provocation. Prosecutors argued that the crime demanded accountability at the highest level the law would allow. And so, in a courtroom filled with reporters, grief-stricken parents, and a stunned community, a teenager stood trial for murder. The defense leaned heavily on Eric's troubled background. They spoke of years of bullying, of emotional trauma, of a child who had been failed by every system meant to protect him. They argued he wasn't a monster. He was a product of neglect, a walking wound. But the prosecution's case was devastating. They laid out the timeline, the luring of Derrick into the woods, the methodical nature of the attack, the sexual mutilation of the body. They emphasized the planning, the opportunity Eric had to walk away, and the fact that he didn't. They reminded the jury that Derrick Robie was 4 years old, that he was murdered not in a moment of blind rage, but over several deliberate, horrific minutes. After a wrenching trial, the jury deliberated. And then, they delivered their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge faced a grim reality. Because of Eric's age, the court was bound by New York state law. The maximum sentence allowed for a juvenile at the time was 9 years to life. That meant parole was possible. But justice, in this case, wasn't just about the sentence. It was about the message. That age does not erase responsibility. That even the youngest among us can commit acts so brutal, so final, that society cannot look away. Eric Smith was taken into custody and began his sentence at a juvenile facility. But as he aged, he would be transferred into the adult prison system, a boy growing into a man behind concrete walls. And outside those walls, the Robie family began their own sentence, one of grief, memory, and unimaginable loss. Every 2 years, they would attend his parole hearings. Every 2 years, they would relive the details. And every 2 years, they would ask the same question: how do you ever forgive the boy who took your son and buried your future in the dirt of a neighborhood park? Eric Smith's name would remain etched into the annals of American true crime, not just because of what he did, but because of who he was when he did it. 13 years old, and capable of something the world would never forget. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was handed down: 9 years to life. For the Robie family, it wasn't enough. Nothing ever could be. Their son was gone, 4 years old, frozen in time. But the story didn't end with the verdict, because Eric Smith, though behind bars, was still a child, and the law allowed for the possibility, however distant, that he could one day walk free. And so began a cycle that would haunt the Robies for decades. 2 years passed, then another. Every parole hearing reopened the wound. Every parole hearing forced Derrick's parents to sit across from the man who had killed their son and plead again for justice not to be undone. They brought photos, spoke of birthdays missed. They described the weight of waking up each day knowing their child was never coming home. And every time, Eric Smith was denied. But with each year, he changed. He earned a GED. He began taking college courses. He worked in the prison library. He attended therapy. To some, he appeared reformed. To others, it was all performance. Psychiatrists debated his progress. Some argued he had developed genuine remorse. Others weren't so sure. They questioned whether remorse was even possible in someone who could describe such a crime in such cold detail. Outside prison walls, the public was divided. On one side were those who believed in rehabilitation, that children, even those who commit unspeakable acts, deserve a second chance. That Eric Smith was a product of years of abuse, a ticking clock that no one had stopped. On the other side were the voices of the Robies, and thousands more who believed that some crimes can never be redeemed, that certain lines, once crossed, can never be walked back. The debate echoed far beyond Savona. Legal scholars, victims' advocates, and state legislators weighed in. Should juvenile offenders with life sentences be given a path to release? Could violent children truly be reformed? And if they could, should they ever be trusted again? Parole denied, again and again, 10 times. Until finally, in 2021, nearly 3 decades after the murder, Eric Smith was granted parole. The decision ignited a firestorm. He was released in February 2022 at the age of 42, the same age Derrick Robie would have been had he lived. The Robie family was blindsided. "It's not justice," they said. "It's just time passing." Smith now lives under supervision, with restrictions on his movements and behavior. The details of his whereabouts are not public for his safety. Some believe he has earned his second chance. Others say the second chance belonged to Derrick and that it was stolen. But the larger question remains: how do we balance justice with rehabilitation? How do we measure remorse? And when the crime is this horrific, can we ever truly trust again? Eric Smith's case became a national touchstone, not just for what was done, but for what followed. It forced a country to re-examine the limits of punishment, the meaning of redemption, the terrifying knowledge that some crimes are committed not by men, but by children. And for the Robie family, one truth remains: there is no such thing as closure, only survival. When we think of killers, we often picture monsters shaped by years of cruelty and crime, men hardened by decades of darkness. But the stories we've explored challenge that image in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. Eric Smith was 13 years old. Derrick Robie, his victim, just 4. And yet the brutality, the coldness, the finality of the crime mirrors what we often attribute to grown men with long rap sheets. That dissonance forces us to ask questions we may not want to answer. What does it mean when a child commits murder? Is it nature? Nurture? Neglect? Can we call a 13-year-old evil? Or are they merely a reflection of the cracks in the world around them? Cracks we ignored until they shattered? The justice system, too, has struggled with these questions. When Eric Smith was sentenced to 9 years to life, many argued it was far too little. Others believed trying him as an adult was itself a kind of violence, punishment without understanding. In the years since his case, the legal landscape has changed. Laws have been re-examined. Some states have introduced stricter sentencing for juveniles accused of violent crimes. Others have done the opposite. pushing for rehabilitation, banning life sentences without parole for minors. The U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in, acknowledging that children are fundamentally different from adults, both in culpability and capacity for change. But what remains is the void, the families left behind, the communities forever altered, the innocence lost, and no law, no sentence, no parole hearing can ever restore what was taken in moments of unthinkable violence. We tell these stories not for sensationalism, but for understanding, to examine the system, to remember the victims, to question what we thought we knew about guilt, justice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and forgiveness. Because these cases are more than just headlines. They are mirrors, and what we see in them, about society, about accountability, about ourselves, is often more disturbing than the crimes themselves. As we close this chapter, we invite you to share your thoughts respectfully. What should justice look like when the killer is a child? Can someone like Eric Smith truly be rehabilitated? Or are their acts so devastating that they leave no room for redemption? This conversation matters because understanding the past is the only way to confront the future. You've been watching America's most dangerous young killers sentenced to death and life behind bars. Case 2. Thank you for joining us.